Let's go to our third learning objective here. So to describe how the central nervous system regulates the dual innervation of the autonomic branch of the peripheral nervous system. So getting back to that comparative secrecy. And here we're going to kind of zoom out again and talk about the big picture of how both divisions of the nervous system operate together. So there's dual innervation to all of the organs. There's a balance between parasympathetic and sympathetic activity. That is when we're at rest, there's sort of a predominance of parasympathetic, but typically both systems are contributing, right? Parasympathetic is giving the rest component, rest and digest. Sympathetic is giving the excitation. But ideally, both components are acting on all of the organs that we have discussed. There is a increased sympathetic, if there's an increased parasympathetic response, that is likewise coupled with a decrease in sympathetic activity. That is to say, if you just had a large meal and you're resting and digesting, or it's late at night and you're getting ready for bed, there's going to be a toning up of the parasympathetic, and simultaneously there's a toning down of the sympathetic. So that's kind of what we mean by that comparative secrecy. If I need to increase one division, by default, I have to tone down the opposite response, right, in order for that to be effective. And then there's increased sympathetic activity, the opposite is true, right, vice versa. So if I'm fighting or fleeing, if there's a threat around, or if I'm stressed, right, stress can be another type of event or trigger that elicits the sympathetic response. And if that occurs, then by default, I have to tone down or decrease the parasympathetic activity. So let's look at a response here that just illustrates that. So someone stands up from a seated or laying position. They stand up quickly. Gravity is going to force blood to begin to pool in their lower extremities. That will decrease the blood pressure in other parts of the systemic arteries. So think about arteries in the thoracic cavity, in the upper limbs, in the head and neck or the brain. The pooling of blood in the lower limbs affects the upper extremities by decreasing blood pressure. That is detected on the visceral receptors in those other areas. So they detect a drop in blood pressure, which is going to be triggering a response. So the afferent fibers, that is fibers that are going towards the central nervous system, will have a decrease in frequency in the action potential. And this ties in something that we've talked about before, this frequency coding. The idea that the way that the nervous system sends or grades different types of responses is by manipulating the frequency or the rate of action potential firing. So in order for us to communicate to the central nervous system that blood pressure has decreased, the decrease in the rate of action potentials is what signals that response. Then we have the cardiovascular control centers in the medulla oblongata. In other words, the integrating centers will detect that decrease in frequency as a signal of drop in blood pressure. And they will generate two responses. So both responses are needed to correct the original error signal. And that is to increase sympathetic activity, especially to organs like the heart and blood vessels, to increase the contractility of the ventricles, but also to constrict blood vessels. And likewise, we have to decrease or tone down the parasympathetic activity so that this can be an effective response. That results in the heart and blood vessels increasing their tone or increasing their contractility, and that will increase blood pressure, and that will turn the error signal off. So this is a part of the greater feedback loops that we've talked about way back when we looked at homeostasis. This is just the specific mechanisms that are helpful in bringing about the autonomic or sort of automatic responses. And importantly here, to think about the comparative secrecy, the fact that both divisions of the autonomic nervous system are involved in this regulation. One has to be toned up and the other has to be decreased, right? So we can see that negative feedback onto the original error signal as we correct that blood pressure. So just to kind of summarize the effects of the parasympathetic nervous system, it's the quiet or relaxed state. It's active in the resting and digesting. It increases the gastrointestinal activity, so it shunts more blood to the GI tract to help with the metabolism of food and so forth. And then it will decrease the heart rate, decrease the blood pressure as well. The sympathetic is the opposite, so it's fight or flight. And we also said freeze here. Freeze or the fawn effect can be a response seen with the sympathetic system. It prepares us for emergency states, for stress, and even exercise. And then it's going to increase heart rate, increase blood pressure. It's going to mobilize energy stores. So it mobilizes glucose into the blood to be broken down to liberate energy for these types of responses, especially for skeletal muscle contraction. It will dilate the pupils. And the reason for this is dilation of the pupils is going to bring more light into the retina. And this can be extremely helpful in surveillance, right? In being able to look around, to be able to scan your environment, and to be able to detect any real threat. So dilation of the pupils is also in sync with the sympathetic response. And then it's going to decrease the gastrointestinal and urinary functions, which is really, again, effective, right? If you're fighting, fleeing, freezing, you're not necessarily focused on digesting a food or even your bowel control. This is why when some people get scared or they have that fight or flight response, they lose control of their bowel or bladder, and then they can have an accident because of this response, right? So really think about the overall picture. If you're in a threatful or threatening situation, what types of responses would you be eliciting? And those are the types of tissues that are going to be heightened or elicited during this type of response. Now, when we are at rest, again, we want to remind ourselves that both branches are active. So both are contributing. The parasympathetic, however, is going to slightly be more predominated, right? So when you're just resting and relaxing, both are still active. We just have more of the parasympathetic input. And then looking at the areas of the brain here, we looked at some of the integrating centers that are in the medulla oblongata. We have certain centers here, the cardiovascular centers. These are going to control things like blood pressure by way of their effect on the blood vessels as well as the heart. The SA node and AV nodal cells, also the actual contractile cells of the ventricles that we'll talk about when we get to cardio. But all tissues of the heart and blood vessels are usually under response by the cardiovascular centers. And then we have respiratory centers that are going to affect the lungs, the respiratory tract as well. Here's another great summary table. This one shows you the parasympathetic effect on different types of tissues, the sympathetic effect on different types of tissues, and then the specific class of adrenergic receptors that would be involved. And just to bring up an example we looked at here, so beta 1 is specifically found on the heart. The sympathetic effect is to increase heart rate and increase the conduction or contraction velocity. And then the parasympathetic would be the opposite, to decrease heart rate and decrease the conduction velocity. So just one example, but really think about all of these different areas and how they are engaged in the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic response. And it's nice to really think about real life scenarios. So when you're thinking about this, think about someone running from a bear. What would their lungs need to do in that scenario? Would their lungs be contracting? Or, would the bronchioles be contracting, or would they be relaxing? With the GI tract, would that be increasing motility and secretion? Or would we be shunting blood away towards more important organs like the skeletal muscle, which are needed for running away? So think about the actual practical response if you are to be engaged in a threat or if you're resting and digesting.